So what's interesting about this war is that the Americans and Iranians have different strategies, and therefore they live in different political realities. So for the Americans and the Israelis, they believe that what they can do is decapitate the regime, the government, and they've done that by killing the Ayatollah Khamenei, and then put tremendous pressure on the military by bombarding the air defenses and military infrastructure, and then exert tremendous pressure on the civilian population by embargoing the economy, and then by embedding themselves and promoting certain dissident groups, whether they be religious, political, or ethnic groups in Iran. They hope to create a color revolution to eventually overthrow the government. Okay, basically what they're trying to do is provoke a civil war in Iran. And so that's the American strategy. And from their perspective, it does seem as though things are going to plan because, again, they have decapitated the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, in the first day. And they've hit civilian infrastructure. So they destroy these oil depots in Tehran. So you might have seen this video footage of black clouds and black air in Tehran these past few days. And they are embargoing the Iranian economy. So they do believe it's going to plan. There's talk of them arming insurgents. From the Iranian perspective, their strategy is very different. They understand that the very basis of the American empire is actually the global economy. So if you put enough pressure on the global economy, you would eventually force America to call uncle. So what we're seeing the first few days are sustained attacks on American military installations throughout the GCC. The American Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. You are seeing sustained attacks on Israel. And in the first few days, actually, the main purpose of Iran was to degrade the air defense of both the Israelis and Americans, basically to blind them. And from reporting, it seems as though the Iranians have achieved this objective, meaning that most of the interceptor inventory is gone, meaning these Patriot missile defenses are no longer relevant in this fight. Also, what's much more relevant is that it seems that much of the radar system is now depleted, meaning that basically with $10,000 Shihad drones, Iran can cause tremendous damage to the GCC and Israel. We're already seeing that in Dubai, where airports, where banks, where data centers are being attacked. Now, one major advantage that Iran has that the Americans don't have is that the Iranians are able to calibrate their attacks. And what I mean by that is the Americans just go and do shock and awe. They try to blow up as many things as possible. Whereas the Iranians, they actually try to figure out what pressure points are in the GCC. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to split off the GCC from the American empire. They're trying to cause instability within these different kingdoms, whether it be Bahrain or UAE or Saudi Arabia. They're basically trying to provoke a civil uprising against these Gulf monarchies. And they're trying to basically splinter the alliance because by controlling the Strait of Hormuz, they can say to the GCC that if you play ball, we'll let your ships through. And that's very appealing to the GCC because the reality is that they depend on the Strait of Hormuz, not just for oil exports, but they also depend on the Strait of Hormuz for food imports as well. Also, we have to remember that if Iran wanted to destroy the entire GCC, it could do so. So Trump has threatened the civil infrastructure of Iran, basically destroy the desalination plants, the electric grid. And Iran's response was that if you do so, then we will destroy the desalination plants of the GCC and destroy the oil refineries of them as well, basically causing their economies to collapse. Because remember, the GCC uses desalination plants for 60% of its fresh water supply, meaning it doesn't have organic fresh water supply. So Iran has far more advantages than the United States in this war. So for these reasons, I actually think that from a military perspective, Iran has more advantages. From a political perspective, it's night and day in that this war is extremely unpopular in the United States. About 3/4 of Americans did not support a strike against Iran. And now that the war has started, you have more and more Americans confused as to the strategy and purpose of this war. And Trump himself has failed to articulate a clear strategy. And it seems as though the rationale behind this war changes every day. So maybe in the beginning it was about protests, and then it became nuclear weapons. And now it's because Israel was going to attack first, and so Iran was going to retaliate against both the United States and Israel, and therefore the United States had to preempt, Israel's preemptive strike. So from a political perspective, right now in America, it's very much a divided nation. Whereas in Iran, it's complete opposite, where the death of the Ayatollah, and also on the first day, remember, an American Tomahawk missile struck a girls' school in the south of Iran that killed about 170 schoolgirls. These are primary school girls, and most of them are actually the children of Islamic Revolution. And so what that has done is galvanize the nation to resist and to defend their sovereignty. Because if you're Iranian, you've seen what the Americans have done across the border in Iraq. You've seen what they've done in Libya and Syria. This is a war of destruction. The Americans are hoping to break Iran into ethnic enclaves, what we call Balkanization, and divide and rule Iran, and basically destroy Persian civilization. And many Iranians will not tolerate this. So for the Iranians, this is a fight to the death. For the Americans, this is a war of choice. So from a military and political perspective, Iran has the advantage. And last, of course, is economic, where the American economy is very dependent on the GCC. In fact, you can argue that the GCC is essentially the linchpin of the American empire, because what they do is they sell the oil in petrodollars, and then they recycle these petrodollars back into the American stock market. And of course, the Gulf markets do that because America provides military protection. But the first day when this war began, what we know is that these American military bases, were abandoned. And in fact, the soldiers changed into civilian clothes and went to hide in hotels. And that's why Iran was striking these hotels. And so these Gulf monarchies now are forced to reconsider their vassalage to the American empire. So what we're seeing, I think, is very much the collapse of the American empire. Right. So I think the best explanation for why this war started and why this war is progressing the way it is a lethal, toxic combination of both hubris and desperation. So let me take some time to explain what I mean. Okay. So the very premise of the American empire is something called the Mackinder Heartland thesis. And this was actually something that the British developed. Okay, so the British was an island. It had a very low population. And for it to control the world, it had to control the seas. So it built the world's greatest navy. And it made sure that this navy was the most dominant in the world. And in fact, they designed the navy to be able to defeat the next two great naval powers combined. And so with a navy is useless against a land power. And so the great fear of the British imperialists is that a great power would emerge in the Eurasian heartland. Okay, so basically Europe and Asia. And at this time, there were several candidates that could have emerged, and we're talking about the 18th century, by the way, that could have emerged to unify the Eurasian heartland and create this continental trade system that would negate British naval power. Okay, so the candidates were the Ottoman Empire, the French, the Germans, and the Russians, these four great powers. And that's what led ultimately to the Napoleonic Wars. Okay, 7 wars fought between France and the British and their allies. And you can actually see the Napoleonic Wars as ultimately an economic trade war, in that Napoleon wanted to create a continental trade system, and the British refused to let him do so because that would mean the collapse of the British economy. And so the British basically had an infinite printing machine called the Bank of England. They financed Europe to fight against Napoleon 7 times. And they lost 6 times, but ultimately they won. And they had no choice because the British economy, like the American economy, is essentially a Ponzi scheme. And so they had to keep on financing until they beat Napoleon. After Napoleon was defeated, Britain became the global hegemon, and then it focused its attention on trying to divide and conquer Germany and Russia. So in the 19th century, Britain engaged in something called the Great Game with Russia, where they fought for Central Asia. Because again, Britain cannot afford for Russia to unify the heartland, because if Russia did that, it could build a railroad system so that all trade could just happen within the continent, and then extend to Africa as well as the Middle East. And then, of course, in the 20th century, Britain and Germany fought 2 great wars, and America came in to save Britain in the end and prevent Germany from unifying the heartland. Okay, so that's the main idea behind the American empire, and it's still true today. And after the Soviet Union fell, America had this unipolar moment where it could extend its empire throughout the world. And this empire came to an end actually in 2022 when Putin invaded Ukraine. And with Russia essentially winning this war in Ukraine, there's a great fear that Russia, Iran, and China would come together as partners in BRICS, and then they could unify the heartland economically and then extend to Europe, Middle East, and Africa, basically BRICS plus. And then they could just dump the US dollar. And right now, the United States is sitting on $40 trillion in debt. And it's a Ponzi scheme. So if other nations stop buying US dollars, then America would be left holding the bag. And then the bomb would explode in their face. The American economy would collapse. And you would see a revolution on the streets in America. So in other words, America didn't really have a choice but to prevent Iran, Russia, and China from forming a heartland alliance. Now, the problem with an empire is that once you become desperate, you make silly decisions. And the reason why is hubris, okay? The belief that you're invincible. And America developed hubris primarily because for the past 20 years, America could do whatever it wanted in the Middle East. So in 2003, it took America exactly 2 weeks to steamroll over Iraq. And they did it so with very little casualties, and they did so with massive political support in the United States. And so America just believed it was invincible. And this sense of inevitability and invincibility cemented itself throughout the Middle East because America, even though it caused a lot of havoc and destruction, it was still triumphant in Libya, in Syria, throughout the Middle East, basically. And so from their perspective, what's the difference between, Iraq and Iran, right? Same name, just one other difference. And so that's the idea of hubris. And this hubris basically blinded Donald Trump with arrogance in Venezuela. Because remember, back in January 3rd, Delta Force swept into Caracas and basically kidnapped Maduro and there was no American casualties. It was a miracle of the American military. It was almost like as though God willed it. And so that made Trump extremely arrogant, and that probably convinced him that he could do anything he wanted because he had the most powerful military in the world. And so, so he basically ordered the invasion, the attack on Iran, believing that the decapitation strike in the first day would cause the regime to collapse because it was so hated by the people. Remember, in January, there were also these protests in Iran. So it was a severe miscalculation, and it was caused by, again, a lethal combination of both hubris and desperation. Hubris in that the empire thought it was invincible, desperation in that it had no choice in the matter but to start this war in order to maintain its hegemony throughout the world. So what people forget is in 2003, when America did shock and awe, there was tremendous military pushback against this doctrine of shock and awe. basically, Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense at that time, and his assistant, Paul Wolfowitz, believed that America could go in with air power, with very little ground troops, and they could very quickly decapitate the regime by destroying its command and control centers. And America could do this cheaply and quickly. And the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, the generals who knew what they were doing, were against this plan. They thought it was insane. They thought it went against centuries of military doctrine. From their perspective, you have to fight the war conservatively and to win. You just can't gamble with war. So I believe at that time, they went in with 100,000 troops. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually initially asked for 500,000 troops because that was what they believed they needed to win this war. And it became a political dogfight, and ultimately Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz won. And their gamble paid off massive dividends. And ever since then, America has adopted its shock and awe policy. Now, the problem with shock and awe is that people forget, but at that time, in 2003, Iraq didn't have any air defense. Okay, it didn't have any way to defend against American invasion. And that was partly because by that time, Iraq had suffered over 10 years of American sanctions. So the economy was depleted, the people were in low morale, and the soldiers were not really paid. Okay, so they didn't have that much air defense. And then when Saddam Hussein was basically advised to get air defense, his response was, listen, if the Americans came after me, then they would eliminate the main adversary to Iran in the Middle East. So why would they do that? That would just be insane. And honestly, if they came, I couldn't really defend myself either. Okay, so that was his thinking. It was extremely logical and rational, but unfortunately, the Americans were not logical and rational because they're an empire. So people forget that 2003 was an anomaly. It was not a real war. But this war in Iran is a real war. And in a real war, you need to use ground troops. Why? Because air defense is meant to defend against the air. So the way you counter air defense is actually with ground troops. Okay? And in a real war, actually the ground troops are the bread and butter. The infantry are the bread and butter of your military. So the Americans have been living in a fantasy world for the past 20 years. And now they need to adapt to the real world if they are to win this war. Now, I understand that a ground invasion would be political suicide in the United States because the war is not very popular. And quite honestly, Donald Trump would need to institute a national draft in order to get the 500,000 combat soldiers that he would need for a ground invasion. And by the way, 500,000 is just the bare minimum. You probably want 2 million troops if you are to fight this war properly. Okay, so half a million is what they are proposing, and they would need a national draft in order to get this number of troops. And you can imagine the political opposition in the United States if that were to happen. Plus, what most military analysts would tell you is that America is not equipped to fight Iran because Iran is a mountain fortress. And America doesn't have the logistics chains, the manufacturing capacity, and an inventory to launch a multi-year ground invasion of Iran from multiple vectors. Okay, so we're talking, you would need to control the Strait of Hormuz, and then you would need to come in from the east, the west, and the north. So it's a very complicated thing, and this would take about 2 years to actually plan properly. But in these 2 years, Iran would get enough assistance from the Russians, the Chinese, and others in order to properly prepare for this ground invasion, and therefore you need to do it as soon as possible before Iran can fully recover from this from this war. Okay, so a ground invasion wouldn't work, but they have to do it if they actually do win this war. Now, I understand. Okay, there are people who say, why not just declare a victory and go home and then end this war? It's not as simple as that. Okay, when a war starts, war developed its own momentum. So let me play out for you using game theory. What would happen if Donald Trump were to say, you know what, we got the Ayatollah, we've destroyed their nuclear weapons program, we've destroyed their ballistics program, we've made the world safe for Israel. Let's just go home, guys. Goodbye. See you later. Okay. here's what would happen, okay? First thing that would happen is Iran would say to the GCC nations, hey man, the Americans came and destroyed our nation. Most of our civilian military infrastructure is gone. We need reparations. You either pay us reparations or we'll come and invade you guys, okay? And GCC nation is like, but we didn't do anything. And the Iranians will be like, well, you know what? You've been hosting American bases for the longest time. Also, they use your airspace to attack us. Also, you're the guys who are financing this war because of your investments in the American economy. And so if the GCC nations refuse to pay reparations, then Iran would cause civil uprisings in these nations. Remember, these are unpopular, corrupt monarchies in the GCC. Iran has basically fallen, and everyone else could fall as well. UAE can be easily taken out. And so what these GCC nations would then say to Iran is, let's make a deal. And the deal is very simple. We have $4 trillion in our sovereign wealth funds. We're going to help you finance the rebuilding of your nation. And also, when our ships go through the Strait of Hormuz, we'll pay you a tax because now you are the defender of the Strait of Hormuz. Okay? So that's the GCC. Basically, the GCC, which was a linchpin of the American empire, now transfers over to Iran, and they become the client states of Iran. That's the first major consequence. The second major consequence is, if you are Japan and South Korea, for the longest time, you've been buying US treasuries at an inflated price. You're basically paying a tax, a tribute to the American empire in order to ensure that the American empire defends you. Well, you just saw what happened in the Middle East. So you're like, why am I doing this? Why am I hosting these American bases when a war starts? These guys, these 50,000 or 100,000 American soldiers will just fly home. So first of all, get out of here, guys. We don't watch you anymore. Second of all, we're not going to buy U.S. treasuries because clearly the United States is not a reliable ally. Okay, so South Korea and Japan would remilitarize and basically become much more self-sufficient economies and stop buying U.S. treasuries.